The turkey was still steaming on the platter when my father tapped his fork against his glass and stood up, and I knew before he opened his mouth that the evening had stopped being about Thanksgiving. He did it the way he always did things that mattered to him, with a little theater, a little smile that told everyone at the table they were about to witness something generous. "I've been thinking," he said, and the whole room settled the way a room settles when the patriarch decides to speak. My mother folded her hands. My aunt set down her wine. Outside the window, the maples on the street had gone the color of rust, and I remember thinking how ordinary it all looked, how warm, right up until the second he turned to me. "Starting this year," he said, "your brother's debts are going to be the family's project. And since you're the one who's done well for herself, you'll be carrying most of it. It's only right. He's going through a hard stretch." He said it like he was handing me a gift. For a beat, nobody moved. Then my mother, without so much as glancing in my direction, added in that flat little voice she saved for the things she'd already decided, "And if you say no, you can stop thinking of yourself as part of this family. We mean it this time." I want to tell you I was shocked. I wasn't what I felt, sitting there with cranberry sauce on my plate, and my husband's hand going still on my knee. Was something closer to clarity, like a window I'd been looking through. My whole life had finally been wiped clean. I picked up my own glass. I stood. The legs of my chair scraped the floor and everyone flinched at the sound. "Then let this be the last thing I ever pour at this table," I said, "and the last dollar any of you will ever see from me." A fork hit a plate somewhere. My aunt made a small sound. Nobody laughed and nobody told me to sit down, because for the first time in 31 years I'd said something they couldn't talk me out of. "My name is Maeve Brennan. I grew up in a brick bungalow in the East End of Hamilton, the older of two, with the one teachers called such a help and relatives called the sensible one, which I have since learned is what people call you right before they hand you something heavy and walk away. I was the kid who did her homework without being asked, and her brother's homework when he asked, the one who got the paper route and split the money, the one who, at 19, drove 2 hours back from Guelph in a snowstorm, because my mother said it would mean so much to have everyone home, and then spent the visit watching my brother open the gifts I'd paid for. It took me a long time to understand that in my family I wasn't a daughter. I was infrastructure. My brother was younger by 4 years and had been, from the cradle, the one things happened to rather than the one who made things happen. When he failed a grade, it was the teacher's fault. When he got fired, it was a personality clash. When he dropped out of the college program our parents had emptied half their savings to fund, it was burnout, stress, a hard stretch. There was always a phrase ready to catch him before he hit the ground. And somehow, I was always the ground. By the time I was 28, I had a good job at an accounting firm downtown, a husband who was kind and steady, and a small house in the East End that I'd bought myself with a down payment I'd scraped together over 6 years of saying no to vacations and yes to overtime. I also had a spreadsheet I never showed anyone where I tracked, almost without meaning to, the money that left my account and went toward my brother. Rent, he was short on. A phone bill. A car repair. The deposit on an apartment he lost 2 months later. A bridge loan for a business idea, vintage sneakers, then a food truck, then a vague thing involving crypto that I still don't understand, that bridged nothing and went nowhere. The number, when I finally added it up, was just over $41,000. $41,000 is a finished basement. It's a year of daycare. It's most of what I'd have needed to start the restaurant. My husband and I kept saying we'd open once we felt secure enough to try for a kid. I'd given it away in pieces small enough that none of them felt like a decision, and that, I think now, is exactly how it's designed to work. What broke something loose in me, long before the Thanksgiving toast, was the co-signing. A year and a half earlier, my brother had wanted to lease equipment for the latest venture, a detailing shop he was going to open with a friend. He needed a line of credit, and his own was, predictably, a disaster. My father called me on a Sunday and used the voice. "He just needs a co-signer to get started," he said. "It's a formality. your name on a piece of paper. You'll never have to think about it again. I want you to understand that I am an accountant. I know what co-signing is. I knew, in the part of my brain that does the work, that co-signing means you are not a witness, you are a borrower, that if he stopped paying, the bank would not send him a stern letter, it would come to me. That my credit and my house and my careful little life were now stapled to a man who had never once finished what he started. I knew all of that. And I signed anyway, because my mother got on the phone and cried, and because 31 years of being the sensible one had worn a groove in me so deep that no couldn't find its footing. So when my father stood up at Thanksgiving and announced that I would now be funding my brother's situation indefinitely, what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the previous month not sleeping. The detailing shop had folded in August. The line of credit I'd co-signed was $22,000 in the hole. Payments missed since June, and I'd found out the way you find out these things, with a call from the bank to confirm my account was past due. I drove home from that dinner with my husband not saying anything, both of us watching the lights of the QEW smear past in the rain, and somewhere around the Burlington Skyway he reached over and put his hand on the back of my neck, and I started to laugh, and then I couldn't stop. And then it wasn't laughing anymore. You don't owe them this, he said quietly. I know, I said. And for the first time, I think I actually did. My phone went off the whole drive home and most of the night. My mother first. 3 calls. Then a string of texts that climbed a ladder from disappointment to fury and back down to a kind of weaponized sadness. We raised you better than this. After everything we sacrificed. You've always been jealous of him. You're tearing this family apart on a holiday. My aunt sent a long message about how family carries each other. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in 2 years told me I'd embarrassed everyone. My brother sent nothing at all, which told me everything, because he'd never in his life had to send anything. Other people sent things on his behalf. That was the whole arrangement. The last text from my mother that night read, "You're being dramatic. We'll talk in the morning when you've calmed down." I sat at my kitchen table after my husband had gone to bed, the house ticking the way old houses do in the cold, and I read that text 4 or 5 times. When you've calmed down. As though the problem was my temperature. As though if they could just keep me at a low simmer for long enough, I'd go back to being useful. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down. Tomorrow, I thought, was the morning they'd find out I hadn't been bluffing. And neither had the silence I was about to give them. My mother showed up at 9 the next morning, coat still on. No knock. Just the sound of her boots on my front step. And then her key. She had a key. She'd always had a key, and I made a note in some cold administrative part of my mind to change the locks. She came in like a weather system. My husband took one look and said he had errands, which was a lie we both appreciated, and left us to it. I made coffee. I didn't offer her any sympathy because I no longer had any to spare. She sat across from me with her purse clutched in her lap like she expected me to take it. "Your brother hasn't slept," she said. "He's a wreck. Your father's humiliated. Do you have any idea how this looks?" There it was. Not is he okay? Not what happened. How it looks. I told her, very calmly, that I had already paid his rent in February, and his phone bill in April, and a parking ticket fiasco in June, that I had co-signed a loan that was now $22,000 overdue, that the bank had been calling me, that my savings were not a public utility. I laid it out the way I'd lay out a file, dates, and amounts, because numbers were the only language left between us that couldn't be turned into a feeling. She laughed. Actually laughed, a short surprise bark. "You make good money," she said. "You'll be fine. He won't. That's just how it is. The strong one helps the weak one." She said it like scripture, like she was doing me a kindness by reminding me of my place. That's what family is, Maeve. I had heard versions of that sentence my whole life, but I had never heard it so plainly. Never heard her say out loud that my entire worth to them was load-bearing. The strong one helps the weak one. It landed somewhere under my ribs and just stayed there, cold. Later that day, my brother finally called, not to apologize, not to explain the loan, not even to ask how I was. One line, his voice thick like he'd been crying or wanted me to think he had. "Why are you trying to ruin me?" And I understood, holding the phone against my ear in my own kitchen, that I had never been his sister to any of them. I'd been a resource, a line of credit with a heartbeat. And once you see that about your own family, you cannot unsee it, no matter how many turkey dinners they set in front of you. 3 days later, my father escalated, the way he always did when a thing wasn't going his way. He made it public. He told me there'd be a family conversation at their place on Sunday, a chance to clear the air. And some soft, hopeful, idiotic part of me, the part that had driven through that snowstorm at 19, still believed that if I just laid out the facts in front of everyone, the truth would do its job. So I went. I walked into my parents' living room, and there were maybe 20 people in it. Aunts, uncles, the cousins. A great aunt who'd been wheeled in from the retirement home in Stony Creek, like a witness for the prosecution. My mother sat in the center of the couch with the posture of a judge. My brother sat beside her with his eyes on the carpet, playing his part. And he has always been very good at that part. My father stood up. He didn't use my nickname. He used my full name, the way he only did when he wanted distance. "We're all here because we're worried about Maeve," he said. "She's decided to abandon her brother at the lowest point of his life. After everything this family has done for her." He let that sit. A murmur went around the room, the soft collective toot of people who'd been briefed before I arrived. Someone behind me said the word selfish, just loud enough to reach me. My great-aunt shook her head slowly, theatrically, at a granddaughter she hadn't spoken to in 5 years. I opened my mouth to say something. To say, "Do you know there's a $22,000 loan? Do you know I co-signed it? Do you know I've already given him $41,000? And my mother raised one hand, palm out, the gesture you'd use to stop traffic. "This isn't a debate," she said. "This is about accountability." And that was the moment, not the toast, not the laugh, not even the phone calls. That, standing in the living room I grew up in, watching 20 people I shared blood with nod along to a story in which I was the villain, while the actual facts sat in my purse in a folder I wasn't going to be allowed to open. They weren't asking me for money anymore. They were rewriting who I was so that the money would feel like a debt I owed. My face went hot. My hands shook. Not from fear, I realized, but from a kind of fury so clean it almost felt like calm. I'd been managing their feelings my whole life. I was done, so I did the one thing none of them expected. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't open the folder. I picked up my coat, said, "Thank you all for coming," in the pleasant voice you'd use leaving a meeting, and I walked out the front door into the October dark while my father was still mid-sentence behind me. I heard the room erupt as the door clicked shut. Let them. They wanted a story. I'd decided somewhere on that front lawn under the streetlight that I was going to let the truth finish it instead. Quietly. With paperwork. The way I finished everything. I went home and I didn't cry that night either. I sat on the couch with my shoes still on and the lights off, and let myself feel exactly how much it hurt, which was a lot. More than I'd admitted in years, because grieving a family that's still alive is a strange and lonely thing. Then I got up, made a pot of tea, opened my laptop, and got to work. Here's the part I'd want you to know if you're sitting where I was sitting. I had assumed, that first panicked night after the bank's call, that I was trapped. That co-signing meant I was simply on the hook forever, that there was nothing to do but pay. That's the belief they were counting on, the helplessness that keeps the strong ones strong only in the direction of giving. But helplessness, I've learned, is mostly just a lack of information, and information was the one thing I'd never let myself gather where my brother was concerned. So I gathered it. First, I pulled my own house in order. I logged into everything, checking, savings, my TFSA, the RRSP I'd been quietly building since I was 23, the little GIC I'd opened the year I got married. I wrote down every automatic transfer, Every recurring loan I'd set up on his behalf and never canceled, and I shut them off, one by one, the way you'd close windows in a house before a storm. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes to stop a bleed I'd let run for 10 years. Then I dealt with the cosign, which was the real chain. And I want to be honest about this because the truth matters more than the fantasy. You cannot simply phone a bank and announce you've changed your mind and float free. That's not how a co-signed loan works. I had signed a binding agreement. In the eyes of the lender, that debt was as much mine as his, and walking away from a table doesn't walk you away from a contract. What you can do is get serious and get help. On Monday, I called a lawyer, not to threaten anyone, to understand my exposure. Her name was Renee Lapointe, and she had an office above a sushi place on King Street, and a way of cutting through panic that I will be grateful for as long as I live. She laid out the landscape for me plainly. I was jointly liable. The missed payments were already on my credit. If it went to default, the bank could and would come after me, including, in a bad scenario, my house. And this was the part that opened a door I hadn't known was there. I could approach the lender about a release of the cosigner, which they might grant if the primary borrower could carry the loan alone, or if it were refinanced. I could also, if it came to that, pay the debt down myself to protect my own credit and then pursue my brother for his share in writing, with a paper trail. None of it was free. None of it was painless. But all of it was mine to do. And that changed everything, because for 10 years I'd been told the only tool I had was my checkbook, and now I had a whole different set. I made my choice. I was not going to keep funding the future. But I also wasn't going to let his mess sink my credit and my marriage out of spite or pride. So I did the cold, sensible thing. I went to the bank, sat down with a loans officer, a patient man named Devin who'd clearly had this conversation before, and I arranged to pay down the overdue balance to stop the damage to my own name, structured so that every dollar was documented. And I had Renee send my brother a formal letter laying out that the $22,000 was now a recorded debt he owed me, with terms in writing signed. For the first time in my life, I helped my brother with money in a way that was about consequences instead of rescue. I protected myself, and then I handed him the bill. And then I stopped fixing things. That was the actual weapon. Not the lawyer, not the bank. Silence. I stopped answering the calls that weren't urgent and the texts that were just pressure dressed up as concern. I stopped being the person who smoothed the road in front of him so he'd never feel a single bump. The road, it turned out, was full of bumps. It started small. The car insurance he'd been between payments on lapsed, because I wasn't there to cover the gap. The phone he was using, on a plan I'd forgotten, was still under my name until I found it canceling the auto pays, went dark. The new landlord, who'd taken him on partly because my parents had vaguely implied the family was good for it, started leaving voicemails when first and last came due, and no one swept in. My father called on a Wednesday 2 weeks after the living room trial. His voice had lost the lectern. "What did you do?" he said. Not a question, an accusation, but underneath it I could hear something I'd never heard from him before. He didn't actually know. He'd always assumed the machine ran on its own. I let the silence sit for a few seconds, the way they'd let theirs sit on me my whole life. I stopped, I said. That's all. I just stopped. He didn't have a script for that. The next while was the hardest, because the fallout I'd set in motion didn't only land on my brother, it splashed onto people I did love, in a complicated way, and I had to learn to let it. My mother left voicemails that swung between rage and a kind of broken pleading I'd never heard, telling me her blood pressure, her sleep, her marriage. My great-aunt, who had nodded along so righteously, was told the full story by someone and called to apologize, which I appreciated and which changed nothing. A cousin texted to say the extended family had had a meeting of their own, and that the suggestion had been floated, finally, that if everyone was so worried, they could all chip in, 20-odd relatives, a couple $100 each. and carry him collectively the way they'd expected one person to carry him alone. I heard nothing came of it. It's easy to volunteer the strong one. It's harder to volunteer yourself. I held the line. Some nights that was easy, and some nights I lay awake feeling like the monster they'd cast me as. Because that's the trick of being the reliable one. They train you so well that your own conscience does their collecting for them. My husband would find me at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning and just sit with me, not arguing me out of the guilt, just keeping me company in it, which is a different and better thing. He was never allowed to fail, I told him one of those nights. Not once. Every single time somebody caught him, and I used to think that was love. I remember the exact shape of the thought as it finished forming. But if you never let someone fail, they never learn how to stand. We didn't protect him. We disabled him. And I was the biggest part of it. That was the night the guilt finally turned into something I could use. Because I understood that the most loving thing I had ever done for my brother was the thing they were all calling cruel. Letting him fall was the only honest gift I had left to give. He hit the ground that winter. I got it secondhand, the way you get all news from a family that stopped speaking to you. The detailing shop debts caught up with him. Without me, he had to declare what he owed to people other than me. Had to sit across from a credit counselor. Had to take a job. An actual job. At a parts warehouse out by the airport, 6 in the morning, steel-toed boots. My mother told an aunt, who told a cousin who, against orders, told me that he'd moved out of the apartment he couldn't afford and into a basement room, and that he was, for the first time anyone could remember, paying his own way badly and resentfully and one paycheck at a time. I won't pretend I didn't cry when I heard that. I did. But not the way you'd think. I cried the way you cry when something you've carried too long is finally set down. My parents came to my house once more, in January, the two of them on my front step in the cold, looking smaller than I remembered them. Older. The way people look when the role they've played their whole lives stops fitting. My mother's voice cracked first. "You didn't have to take it this far," she said. I looked past her and my father, who couldn't meet my eyes, and I noticed that my brother wasn't with them, and that told me more than anything either of them could say. They hadn't come to reconcile. They'd come because the one person who'd always absorbed the impact was gone, and they were feeling, for the first time, the full weight of the lives they'd built on top of me. "We just want our family back," my father said. And I almost laughed because it was such an honest thing without him meaning it to be. They didn't want me back. They wanted the version of me that made everything easier. They missed the buffer. They missed the cushion between themselves and consequence. They had never once, in 31 years, asked what any of it cost me, and they weren't asking now. I stood in my own doorway with the cold coming in around me, and I felt, finally, completely, no anger at all. Just a great quiet. "I'm not coming back to that," I said. "But I'm not going to spend the rest of my life angry at you either. I'm just going to live a different way than the one you wanted for me." "So that's it," my father said. "You're walking away from your own family." "No," I said, and I held the door open a little wider, not to invite them in, just to make the point. "I'm walking forward. There's a difference. You should try it." They left without another word. I watched their car back out of my driveway and turned on the street, taillights small in the dark, and then I closed the door and stood in my warm front hall and breathed. And the silence in my house didn't feel like loss. It felt like something I'd finally earned. I'd love to tell you there was a dramatic reunion, that my brother showed up changed and grateful, and we all wept and the credits rolled. Real life is quieter than that. He paid me back 4 months of the debt and then stopped. And Renee says I can pursue it, and I probably will, on principle, but I no longer lie awake over it. We text now and then, carefully, like two people who've agreed not to bring up the war. He still works at the warehouse. He complains about it, but he goes. Last I heard, he'd been promoted to a shift lead, which is the first thing he's ever held on to. And I'd be lying if I said some stubborn part of me wasn't proud. The way you're proud of something you had to stop carrying before it could ever learn to walk. My parents and I speak twice a year on the surface about the weather and their knees. My mother has never once apologized, and I've stopped needing her to. You can love people and still refuse to be used by them. It took me 3 decades and $41,000 to learn that those two things aren't a contradiction. This past Thanksgiving, I didn't go east. My husband and I roasted a small chicken in our own kitchen instead. Just the two of us. And, this year, the very beginning of a third. We finally opened that account we've been putting off, the one for a kid. And there's a nursery taking shape down the hall where the office used to be. I think about that a lot. About the basement I could have finished, the years I could have had back, the whole future I've been handing away in pieces small enough not to notice. It's all still here. It was always going to be mine. I just had to stop giving it away. On Thanksgiving night, after the dishes were done and the house was quiet, I poured myself a single glass of wine and stood at the window the way you do when a year is turning over inside you. The street was dark and clean. The maples had gone to rust again, and I lifted my glass, not in anger, not in triumph, just to the version of me who finally stood up at that table and meant it. To endings, I said. To no one, to the cold glass and the quiet street. And to never again mistaking somebody's grip on my wrist for the feeling of being held. For a long time I believed that being the dependable one made me good, and it took losing my whole family at a Thanksgiving table to see that I'd confused being useful with being decent. They were never the same thing. I was generous in the way a tapped maple is generous, drained quietly until there's nothing left to give. And I called that love because no one ever taught me there was another word for it. What I understand now, sitting in my own kitchen with a nursery taking shape down the hall, is that everything that happened followed a simple chain. My brother never grew because he was never once allowed to fall. Every gap I filled removed a lesson he needed. Every check I wrote bought him one more year of staying small. I thought I was holding him up. I was holding him down, and my parents handed me the rope and called it duty. The night I stopped, the consequences didn't appear from nowhere. They'd been waiting the whole time, dammed up behind me. I just finally stepped out of the way and let the water find its level. There are 3 things I'd want my own kid to carry, and I learned all of them backwards. The first is that doing the right thing and doing the easy thing are almost never the same, and that real honesty sometimes looks heartless to people who've grown comfortable with your silence. Saying no to my mother at that table felt cruel. It was the kindest, cleanest thing I'd done in a decade. The second is that good intentions without clear thinking are just a slower kind of harm. I had the heart to help my brother for 10 years, but it wasn't until I sat down with Renee and actually understood what a co-signature meant, what I owed and what I didn't, that my care finally did something other than enable. Feeling is not a plan. You have to know things, and you have to be willing to do the cold arithmetic before the warm gesture. And the third is that none of it matters without the spine to hold the line after you've drawn it. Anyone can leave a room. The hard part came the nights afterward, when the guilt arrived dressed up as my mother's voicemails and I had to sit in it and not cave. Standing firm when everyone you love calls you the villain is its own kind of strength. And no one can give it to you. You build it one refused phone call at a time. I'm not angry anymore. I poured myself a glass this Thanksgiving and I didn't toast to revenge or to winning. I toasted to the woman who finally stood up, and to the simple, lifelong work of never again mistaking somebody's grip on my wrist for the feeling of being held.